I'm going to tell you something. If you two never bother with me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving up that shit. I can't. There's good friends of mine out there say, well, he's divorced, you have to do his stuff. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the one is. The boss is your boss.
And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. And this is our first episode of the Five Families in the history of the Five Families. We are going to cover you right up until the Castellammarese Wars today. So with that, we're going to begin. Next week, we'll do part 2. And if there needs to be a part 3, we will definitely do a part 3. And what we may do after we finish with the Genovese crime family history is we may do like a Q&A over on Facebook, and you can ask or you can submit questions about the Genovese crime family that maybe I didn't get to that you want answered. So we'll probably do that, but keep it dialed into Facebook for that. All right, so the Genovese crime family history, 1880s to 2021, but we're probably not going to touch 2020, 2021. Probably we'll cut it off around 2010 or 12. Just depends on how sensitive some of the stuff is. The Genovese crime family has always been considered the Ivy League of crime families. In this particular show, I just want to discuss the origins of the crime family, sort of how they began, and some of the players that are involved. Now, granted, some of this information is going to be a little repetitive for some of you, but it's important to understand that the lineage of every crime family is what we're going to try to accomplish over the next couple of weeks. While it's impossible to talk about every single member, we're going to highlight a bunch of different things in one of the most introspective and detailed shows that you're probably ever going to get the chance to listen to, starring, of course, the Genovese crime family. For starters, the first noted Mafia activity, at least reported in the United States, actually did not take place in New York. A lot of people think it did. It didn't. The first known knowledge of the Mafia in the United States took place in the spring of 1869, believe it or not, in New Orleans, Louisiana. And it was actually in the spring of 1869. So Sicilians flooded into the country, and New Orleans ran an article in 1869 about Sicilian counterfeiters, murderers, who had somehow formed some sort of criminal business association in New Orleans. Many confused that with the Black Hand, and many confused the Black Hand as being the first recognized group in America from organized crime, but that simply isn't true. The Black Hand was simply a method that Italians used to extort victims. So they weren't an organization. The name really stemmed from an extortion racket, really, to be honest with you, which was brought to this country by mobsters of Sicilian origin. While the Black Hand was not a criminal gang, there were small cliques of mobsters who used the Black Hand technique, which led people to essentially call them the Black Hand. The first noted mobster in the United States, at least the first Sicilian known mobster, would have been Giuseppe Morello. We're going to call him Joe throughout the show, so don't get confused. Morello was born in Corleone, Sicily in 1867. His father died when he was young. His mother would end up marrying Bernardo Terranova, who was a made guy in the Corleonese Mafia. His mother and Bernardo would have 5 children, 2 sons named Vincent. One of them would have died at a very young age. Ciro, Rosalia, Salvatrice, and Lucia. Many throughout the years of doing the show have asked how Ciro Terranova was related, and he was Joe Morello's half-brother. It was through Bernardo's tutelage that Joe and the Terranovas were brought into the Mafia life to begin with. Both Vincent, Ciro, and Joe were introduced into the life and had committed murders for the local Mafia clan before they were 17 years old. So they came over here already fucking packing pistols. They knew how to take care of business. They then would be inducted into the Corleone Mafia. It was a result of a few murders that Joe Morello ended up fleeing for New York City shores, as there were warrants for his arrest for multiple murders. His uncle Joe Battaglia was actually the boss of a clan over in Italy, and he would ensure that Joe got safe passage as a stowaway on a ship, as the Italian authorities were pretty much watching the port to make sure he didn't leave, but he got on and he got the fuck out. The exact date of when Morello sort of left Italy isn't noted anywhere because, like we said, he wasn't registered on the ship's manifest because he was a stowaway. Not only was he wanted for murder, but he had been running a sophisticated counterfeiting ring. One of the members of that counterfeiting ring ran to the police and started informing, and it was enough for Morello to get the fuck out of Italy. Even though he was tried and convicted in absentia, which is something that Italy is notorious for doing, he was convicted with not being there for counterfeiting. Then in September of 1894, he was convicted again in absentia of murder and sentenced to 6 years and 45 days in prison. The rest of his siblings and family would not arrive in New York City until 1894. So Joe Morello first arrived in New York, and then he ends up going to Louisiana in the mid-1890s, which would coincide with the article coming out in the Louisiana papers about the organization of criminals who were forming together as bandits and all this other nonsense. He would get spooked out by that article, and he ends up going to Texas. And he gets to Texas, he works the fields. That ends up not working, and so he ends up going to New York City. In between the time he arrived to New York and by the time his family arrived, he would form the 107th Street Mob, which would eventually evolve into the Morello crime family. Some of the notable members of the 107th Street Mob were Lucky Luciano, Tommy Lucchese, Salvatore D'Aquila, Joe Masseria, Ignazio Lupo, Frank Costello, and Arnold the Brain Rothstein. Morello would settle into Manhattan off Prince Street. In 1903, he solidified ties to another tough mobster by the name of Ignazio the Wolf Lupo, who would end up sort of solidifying those two factions together by marrying Morello's half-sister Salvatrice. Lupo was the boss of a Sicilian crew in Little Italy. In 1902, Morello had acquired a bar just literally across the block from Lupo's headquarters, and the two kind of became friends, and that's how Morello's half-sister Salvatrice would meet him. Lupo was a no-nonsense fucking criminal who pretty much had a lockdown on the extortion rackets at the time. Lupo would eventually move his operations to East Harlem. Morello, by all accounts, was also a no-nonsense guy who was nicknamed the Clutch Hand for his lobster-like claw hand. If you've ever seen the National Enquirer, the Lobster Boy, he had lobster boy hands. I shouldn't laugh at that, but it's silly to me. He had no patience for insubordinate people, and he did not like the word no for any reason. He would kill or order the death of anybody who trespassed against him. Lupo eventually began to slowly get involved with different crimes and schemes and saw that Morello was a natural-born leader and a natural-born moneymaker. Lupo was also Morello's go-to guy for murder. In a 10-year span, and this is no bullshit, Lupo would whack over 60 people. That's 6 a fucking year. Jeffrey Dahmer, eat your fucking heart out. You couldn't do that. The family typically employed stabbing, murder, torture, but specifically used the barrel murder technique. And the barrel murder technique was quite a famous thing. It was a process by which they would kidnap somebody, they would torture them for days, then they would either shoot them, stab them, or strangle them, and they'd stuff them into a barrel, and they would take the barrel and either put it on a corner where it could be found, they'd throw it in the ocean, or they would ship the barrel and its contents to an address which was vacant. The first ever usage of this method was recorded in New Orleans, of all places, by the Provenzano crime family, then by the Morello crime family. The technique would lead to the biggest lynching in American history. March 14th of 1891, the New Orleans lynched 11 Italians for the role in allegedly killing then police chief Dennis Hennessy. The problem is that all 11 of those people, of the 19, 11 were acquitted, found not guilty, and the town thought the mob bribed the jury. And so they took shit into their own hands, and a large crowd broke into the jail and killed 11 of the 19 suspects. So that'll go down in history as the biggest lynching ever. Morello would hammer down the turf, and he would overtake loan shark and extortion, money laundering, counterfeiting, the Italian lottery, and robbery. Morello would use the money made by illegal means to legitimize himself by investing in legitimate companies. He would buy bars, stores, restaurants, etc. He was the first person ever in the history of organized crime, at least in this country, to legitimize his illegal proceeds. They were the only group in New York City to do this. Other groups were not doing that. They were taking their money and just going with it. They didn't establish legitimate businesses. Therefore, they could not prove that the income came from legit sources. He was the first one to really realize that this shit's got, it's got to look on the up and up here. So one of the other things, that Morello was very inventive. As extortion was paramount, especially doing business in the city. He realized that others who were committing extortion refused to take smaller amounts for loan sharking and extortion. Everybody wanted to be greedy, and Morello saw that big protection amounts would likely bankrupt people. And so the whole idea here is to keep the money coming in. So he would take smaller amounts, and they would just pay over a longer, extended period of time. To him, it wasn't about the short game; it was the long game. He took what the Black Hand essentially made and formed and invented and brought to this country, and he learned from his childhood that money from a lot of people outweighed a lot of money from a few people, if that makes any kind of fucking sense. It revolutionized the mob. It revolutionized the way they did business. Eventually, Ignazio Lupo would merge his family with the Morello family, and they would become the Morello-Lupo crime family, and they controlled really the majority of Manhattan and some other areas. They would promote Salvatore D'Aquila and Joe Masseria to capos within the family. By 1905, he controlled pretty much the entire Mafia and was considered the boss of bosses. Lupo didn't really mind deferring to Morello at all. He had no issue with Morello being the head of the Mafia, as they just sort of played off each other. They would defer to each other, so it was a business move. In 1909, both Morello and Lupo were arrested in connection with counterfeiting. So once again, we see Morello sort of does counterfeiting bullshit in Italy, gets caught, gets convicted, comes here and starts the same sort of shit, and gets arrested for it. In 1910, both would be found guilty and sentenced to 25 to 30 years each for those crimes. With the hierarchy essentially gone from the Morello-Lupo crime family, somebody had to step up. That guy is going to be Niccolo Morello, also known as Niccolo Terranova, but they would often use Morello as their names. The Morellos controlled most of New York City, specifically East Harlem and Greenwich Village, but there was an issue brewing in Brooklyn, and that problem was the Camorra. Coney Island boss Pellegrino Marano was really specifically their problem. Marano had desires of removing the Morellos from East Harlem, as he wanted control of the lucrative Italian lottery rackets, and standing in his way from encroaching into that territory that the Morellos really did want to have them for themselves, was a guy who we're going to call Joe Gallucci. Gallucci, while being a Camorra boss, controlled an area that the Morellos wanted, and Morello knew that if they got their hands on it, it would be a monopoly for the Morellos should they decide to go after Gallucci. In 1915, Marano pretty much makes his move by hiring men to kill Gallucci. In 1915, Gallucci ends up getting whacked, and the Morellos that sort of overseeing, or not overseeing, but the Morellos seeing from the periphery that Gallucci gets killed, pretty much plan on moving in to fight over turf and that racket specifically. But it would take a few minor things to make things a little bit worse. The Morellos had to, first of all, they had to make a move. Some attempted to subvert the Morellos, specifically the Delgadio brothers. They had a piece of the East Harlem rackets as well. The Morellos moved quickly, and they whacking both the Delgadio brothers. It was assigned to the Camorra that the Morellos just weren't going to sit back and let them do this. Joe DeMarco was a target of the Morellos, as he ran a few gambling dens in Little Italy, which was against the Morellos' creed, and it was also somewhat in their territory, and they wanted everybody out of their territory. It should belong to them. So they end up trying to hit DeMarco several times, but were unable to kill him. The Morellos felt that maybe the Camorra could help, and perhaps could even open up a bridge to some dialogue. Things were still a little bit nasty between them, but it wasn't to the point of no return at this time. They would go see the Navy Street mob and the Coney Island mob, specifically Morano and Loretano, respective leaders within their own crews. Niccolo Terranova would go see them with Stevie LaSalle in tow, and he would explain the situation with DeMarco. The meeting was also sort of a reference point for them to cut up turf, as the Morellos were willing to give up certain areas in return for the favor of the Coney Island boys and the Navy Street boys killing DeMarco. Morano and Loretano agreed in principle. All right, we'll go ahead and do it. So Nick Morello, who is Niccolo, and his associate Steve LaSalle, also with Ciro Terranova and Giuseppe Verrazzano, met the Brooklyn gang members at Loretano's cafe to sort of organize how this was going to go down. The plan was for Verrazzano to get an undercover hitman into DeMarco's gambling establishment. He points him out, and the rest would be history. And it was probably a really bad fucking idea from the very beginning. The first attempt was a total fucking failure. John Fetto, who was a Navy Street hitman, showed up late to the hit. By the time he gets there, DeMarco had already taken off. The second attempt wasn't really much better, as they would find out that Joe Nazzaro would be traveling with DeMarco during the day to a meeting. They would add John Esposito to the hit squad, sort of multiply their numbers. And later that day, Esposito and Fetto would head over to the bar and wait for Verrazzano. The plan was simple. Verrazzano would point out DeMarco, and the rest would be history once again. Sounds easy to do, right? So Verrazzano arrives and soon points out DeMarco as he walks by the window. Fetto and Esposito leave, with Verrazzano with them, following them over. They get to the front door of the gambling den, and there was a guy by the name of Nick Sassi who was pretty much with DeMarco and his crew, but he pretty much was able to be bought off. And then that's essentially how it went down, and he sort of lets him in. He shouldn't have, but that's what he does. So the guys walk in, and they walk to a back room where the card games were being played. Inside the back room, DeMarco, Chris Lombardi, and other gangsters and numerous people were watching the card game. To identify the target for Esposito and Fetto, Verrazzano sat down right across from DeMarco. Outside the room, Sassi and Rocco Valente from the Navy Street were standing watch to make sure that everybody can get their fucking ass out of there the minute the shots start going off. Suddenly, Esposito pulls out his gun and fatally shoots Lombardi. The nervous gunman had misread the signals from Verrazzano and thought that he was shooting DeMarco. Working quickly, Verrazzano managed to kill DeMarco himself. The Navy Street gunmen crawled out of a bedroom window onto Oliver Street and safely made their escape. That evening, Nick and Vincent Morello, LaSalle, That evening, Nick and Vincent and Stevie LaSalle and Verrazzano all traveled to the Navy Street Gang headquarters. They advised Loretano that Joe DeMarco was definitely dead, and they gave Loretano $50, which was equal or equivalent to almost $1,200 in today's time period, to pass on to his gunman for helping up. It was a botched hit, a fucking horrible hit. They didn't do it right. Turns out that Verrazzano could have done this shit himself. He didn't need, everybody else to go and do this. With the end of DeMarco, the Morellos were able to expand into Little Italy, further taking over control of DeMarco's rackets. The Camorra saw this as greed, and they were upset that the Morellos had not held firm to their agreement. And then they began to move into Little Italy, opening their own gambling dens. Alessandro Valero, who had ambitions of his own, who was a member of the Navy Street, didn't like the agreement between the Morellos and his crew. He was a Navy Street guy, and he never trusted the Morellos. He specifically didn't agree with the fact that they got involved with the Morellos in the killing of DeMarco. They should have just done it themselves and told the Morellos to get fucked. That was his opinion. And so war is sort of now brewing because guys are pissed off. What was promised by the Morellos isn't coming through. So the Camorra travels to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to visit the Camorra leadership. That's where the leadership was. And they wanted the Camorra leaders to get involved and join their side because they were going to go to war. At this meeting, they would agree in principle, and they would agree that a message needed to be sent. War was on the brink, and the Morellos really didn't want war. They didn't want war. They wanted peace. Moreno saw Morello as weak and said no to the offer of a piecemeal situation. Both sides, because one of the things Morello did was he wanted to sort of get a meeting and have peace, and Morello looked at that like, you punk bitch, you want peace now because now you're about to get served. Both sides would sort of go to war for a couple of months, and eventually what Moreno does is he suckers Morello. He sends word that he's willing to end the war and he wants peace. Moreno invited Morellos down to Navy Street in Brooklyn for a sit-down. For 6 months, this kind of went back and forth. Morello would sort of waver about it, wasn't sure if he trusted him, but eventually he agrees to it. On September 7th of 1916, Nick Morello goes to Brooklyn. Morello would take his bodyguard Charlie Ubriaco with him. As they enter the club, both are shot in the fucking head immediately. Moreno then immediately moves against Joe Verrazano, killing him. The Neapolitans didn't worry about witnesses. They didn't worry about cops because they paid everybody off, but that would come back to haunt them. When I say Neapolitans, I mean the Camorra. A war is now going to happen. There's just no way around it. And this would be known as the Mafia Camorra War. As a result of the death of Morello, Ciro and Vincent Terranova would take over the Morello crime family. Vincent would be the boss, as Ciro would then serve as his underboss. In 1915, one of the hitmen in the murder of Nick Morello, a guy by the name of Ralph Daniello, ends up just fucking becoming a rat, and he ends up telling the police that Moreno and Valero were behind the hit on Nick Morello. That ends up getting them arrested and convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. As the Mafia Camorra War sort of ends, there were other problems that were coming. While they had fought off the powerful Camorra and seemingly somehow sort of won, it was likely only because of a stool pigeon that they did, but they had bigger enemies. In 1920, the Volstead Act ends up getting installed. Obviously, we know that as prohibition, and it prohibited the manufacturing and sales of alcohol other than for medicinal purposes. The family would then begin a lucrative bootlegging operation. In 1920, both Joe Morello and Ignazio Lupo would be paroled. While he was gone, Salvatore D'Aquila, who was a captain and a big supporter of the Morello crime family, took off and sort of, formed his own crime family and now oversaw the Lower East Side of Manhattan and Brooklyn. He saw the release of Morello and Lupo as a dangerous, volatile situation to be in. And what he does is he orders their deaths immediately. D'Aquila had left the family, obviously, in 1910, right as Morello goes to prison, forms his own family, and named himself Boss of Bosses. A lot of these guys in these days kept naming themselves Boss of Bosses. Morello would then pretty much take off to Sicily for a couple of months. He was afraid he was going to get killed, and so he took off. And he would obviously eventually return, but Umberto Valente offered to kill both Morello and Joe Masseria, who was really Morello's chief ally, chief tough guy, chief bodyguard for Morello. And Joe Masseria kind of catches wind of what's going on, and he's fucking irate. Masseria wasn't going to tolerate D'Aquila's nonsense, and so he immediately goes after Rocco Valente, who was a member of the Camorra in Brooklyn. On December 29th, 1920, Valente's strongest ally, Salvatore Moro, gets whacked. In response to that, Salvatore D'Aquila has Vincent Terranova killed. That move essentially made Ciro Terranova the official boss of the Morello crime family. Soon after, Masseria moved on D'Aquila again, killing Silva Tagliagamba. Then in August of 1922, Valente ends up getting whacked, which ended the issue between D'Aquila and the Morellos. There would be a lot of controversy considering what is coming next. Masseria, by all accounts, really showed his battle mettle, his intelligence, his brutality, and he didn't take over the Morellos in a hostile takeover. That you will read on so many pages that, Masseria was a real piece of shit and just thought he was the shit, just took over by force. And that's not what happened. Reality is Morello elevated him. Morello saw the writing on the wall that his time was done, and so he elevated Masseria to boss and made himself consigliere of the crime family. On October 28th of 1928, Masseria gets his revenge and kills Sal D'Aquila, and that effectively made him the boss of bosses. Stay tuned on Mob Talk Radio. We'll be right back, and we will continue with the history of the Genovese crime family. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are continuing with the first part of the history of the Genovese crime family. Last thing we left off, Masseria gets his revenge and has Salvatore D'Aquila killed, which effectively makes him, at that point, the boss of bosses. Masseria would begin to then expand his operations, expanding into bootlegging, loan shark, and extortion and gambling. To protect his rackets, he brought in an influx of up-and-coming gangsters, those being Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia. They were all brought in to protect the rackets. Masseria would then demand all fringe criminals outside of that family, albeit gangs, small crews that were not controlled by him, had to pay tribute for all of their illegal activities. On the back end of things, Salvatore Maranzano had arrived in New York on behalf of Don Cascioferro, who was at one point in the United States, went back to Sicily, but he wanted control of American rackets. I don't know where the guy thought he got the balls from. But Cascioferro wanted rackets, and he wanted Salvatore Maranzano to just come here and announce himself as boss and take out Joe Masseria. Maranzano had quietly begun to build up some turf and territory. Masseria didn't, on the other hand, didn't hesitate to kill. And this would be some of the backbones to what would happen next. In Detroit, Michigan, there was a vie for power. There was a feud between rival groups after the murder of then-boss Sam Catalanate. The east side and the west side had warred for years, and under Catalanate, sides had been peaceful. After his death, the west side leader, Chet Lamare, sent word to east side leader, Angelo Melli, that he wanted to have a meeting and sort of just chop up turf, ensuring, let's not let this get out of hand. We've been warring for years. Let's kind of try to get together and do this the right way. Melli was a pretty bright guy and saw through the meeting that this was not about a meeting. That he was a marked guy. He just saw through it. Melli instead figured that he would send mob peacemaker Gaspar Milazzo instead. Milazzo was a type of guy that you bring in, like a consigliere that could help mend fences and say, let's do the right thing here. And he was very, very, very well respected by multiple mob families. And so Milazzo basically agrees to go. What neither knew and what Lamare knew is that Masseria supported Lamare and backed up his idea to take over the complete Detroit Mafia. He didn't give a fuck if he clipped anybody. He had the support of Joe Masseria, and that's all he needed. The only reason why Masseria even supported Lamare to begin with was because Milazzo refused. He had a beef with Milazzo because Milazzo at one point had refused to intercede on his behalf when he had a beef with Al Capone with the Union Siciliani dispute. If you want to look up the Union Siciliani, you can look that up for yourself. But there was a beef that he had with Al Capone. He wanted Milazzo to sort of step in and help buffer that with getting sort of his side of the argument with the Union Siciliani, and he didn't. And so he had a beef. And that's the only reason why he supported Lamare whatsoever. The move if known, would probably have infuriated. It would have infuriated Milazzo, Bill Tocco, and Joe Zarelli. Milazzo went to the meeting, which took place at the fish market off Verner Highway in Detroit on May 31st, 1930. Milazzo took his bodyguard, Sam Sassa, I don't know why I fucking squelched on that. Sam Sassa, Perino, while waiting for the Lamare. They began to eat when suddenly two men popped up from a nearby booth with sawed-off shotguns. Milazzo was shot twice in the head and face, which literally blew his fucking face across the room, all over the walls, all over the floors. Clean up on aisle 5, Dave. Perino ended up getting shot in the stomach and arm and died a couple of minutes later. Tocco, Melli, and Zarelli were absolutely infuriated and hell-bent on revenge. Mobsters across the country blamed Masseria for backing that up. It didn't help also that Milazzo was very tight with Salvatore Maranzano. So Milazzo, who thought he, was aligned with Masseria, really isn't. Masseria is holding, fucking hatred for him because of something that happened years before. So Masseria backs Lamare. Lamare pushes a button and says, kill Milazzo. But what they didn't realize was Milazzo was very, very tight with Salvatore Maranzano. Other mob guys would also blame Joe Masseria for the murder of Gaetano Reina. When the chaos of the 1910s went on inside the Morello crime family, Salvatore D'Aquila Reina ended up splitting from the family. They were both high up in that family prior to that. As soon as Morello goes to prison, forget it, they ran. And Masseria never forgot that. Reina, since splitting, had formed his own family and taken over the Bronx and parts of East Harlem. And this may be confusing because I know you keep hearing, well, this group and different people owned smaller sections of East Harlem. So when we talk about Tony Salerno, he ran all of East Harlem. Tony Salerno literally owned Harlem, all of Harlem, not like a block. In these days, the turf was split up into smaller sections. So you might have two guys running the same sort of area. And of course, they'd both call themselves the bosses or whatever. So anyway, Masseria never forgets that. So Reina, like I said, had split and formed his own family and taken over the Bronx and parts of East Harlem. He had $1 million monopoly on ice box distribution in the Bronx. Those are the days when they would deliver the fucking ice by truck and et cetera, et cetera. At one point, Reina, realizing that Masseria had ambition, would end up joining back with Masseria in terms of splitting rackets. He realized, okay, Masseria's going to try to take over here. I need to pick the right fucking horse. And he sort of gets friendly with them again and even cuts him in on some of the rackets. But Masseria, however, was never going to let go of the old betrayal. And when Reina switched sides, as the heat was ramping up against Maranzano, Reina runs to the Maranzano side again. And Masseria does not act well to this. He had Reina killed. Masseria went to Lucky Luciano and said, I want you personally to handle this. On February 26th of 1930, Reina's coming out of his alleged girlfriend's home in the Bronx. As he exits the door and gets close to the curb, Vito Genovese, of all fucking people, appears with a sawed-off, double-barreled shotgun and blew Reina's fucking head off. Good old Vito. Oh, jeez. I find Vito comical in a certain kind of way. So Vito Genovese is contracted out by Lucky Luciano and handles fucking business. And also the fact that Reina was a friend of Maranzano made it like strike number fucking 3 for them. The murder of Milazzo, the murder of Reina pushes Maranzano over the edge. On August 15th of 1930, Joe Morello and his friend Giuseppe Pirano are sitting in his office in Harlem. Men walked in, shot and killed both of them. Point blank. Pop, pop, pop. Over. That's when the war officially begins. After Reina gets whacked, Masseria puts Joe Pinzolo in charge of Reina's former icebox racket. Now, what I don't understand, and the only thing that leaves me sort of confused, is that why Maranzano would even tolerate Masseria trying to take over Reina's icebox racket, because technically if he was with Maranzano, that should have reverted back to him. But that's probably like another fucking reason why Maranzano went nuts. A month after Morello gets killed, Pinzolo gets hit in Times Square office, which was then owned, well, what would become the Lucchese crime family. It was owned by the Mafia family. Whatever was left of Reyna's crew would end up fleeing and joining the Maranzano faction. Masseria, not to be outdone, would whack Joe Aiello, who was then president of the Detroit chapter of the Union Siciliani. So we see Masseria just saying, you know what, fuck this, I'm going to kill this prick too. And he was doing it not only because he had a personal beef with the Union Sicilian for getting fucked in the Al Capone beef, but now he's like it's comical to me because I can see the guy sitting there going, yeah, you know what? I don't like that fucking union, so I'm going to kill the fucking head of the union in Detroit. That ought to really piss off those other assholes in Detroit. It's just another reason to start fucking war. So after Joe Aiello gets whacked, the war sort of begins to turn in the favor of the Camorra and obviously Maranzano. On November 5th of 1930, Manfredi Mineo, who was formerly underboss under D'Aquila, ends up getting killed. Mineo had played both sides of the fence, and once at one time fighting D'Aquila, then secretly helping Masseria kill D'Aquila. Steve Ferrigno, who is considered the underboss to Mineo, ends up getting killed. Frank Scalish, who would inherit control over that crew, would then take off to the Maranzano faction. So you've got guys going back and forth to different sides. Scalish wasn't the only one. As many supporters of Masseria began to see that Maranzano was willing to be deadly, he was very calculated, he was very patient, and he seemed to have complete control of himself to some extent, whereas Masseria is like, I don't like that union, kill that fucking prick. And that may be the wrong sort of stereotype, but that's just kind of what I get from it. And many would begin to defect. Attempting in many ways to back the right horse. They got to pick the right side of the fence to be on, and they're going to get killed. On February 3rd of 1931, another important Masseria lieutenant, Joe Catania, ends up getting gunned down, dying 2 days later. So in the background of all of this fucking nonsense, Lucky Luciano is obviously underneath Masseria, is high up on the food chain. He ends up becoming sort of Masseria's number 2, number 3 guy, go-to guy for everything. And he sort of begins to sort of have some reservations. Luciano in many ways had come to resent Masseria. While he understood the jockeying for position, he didn't like how bigoted Masseria was. Masseria would only work from those from his Sicilian village. He refused to work with Jewish people. He refused to work with the Irish. And Luciano saw this as business and money, and that's the bottom line. And two men fighting over money was just going to bring heat. He thought that Maranzano and Masseria, they were fighting over money. There's no reason. There's enough rackets, enough turf. The conflict is nonsense. But what really particularly sort of pissed Luciano off was that Masseria consistently made fun of Frank Costello, called him names behind his back. Costello is a guy who killed for Masseria. And just the sheer disrespect over the fact that he was Calabrian and not Sicilian, it didn't make any sense to Luciano because Costello was one of the most loyal guys you could ever ask to be around. So Luciano slowly begins to sort of intermingle with other criminals. And he feels that there's so much to learn from Jewish people, Irish people, specifically Arnold Rothstein, who was sort of teaching him and Costello how to go from the streets and being a part of a gang to forming a criminal empire. The group, so Luciano begins to really hang out with a couple of different people. They ended up calling them the Young Turks, and that included Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Bonanno, who really didn't hang out that often, and we'll get to why. Joe Adonis, Carlo Gambino, Tommy Gagliano, and Joe Profaci. Granted, Bonanno had backed Maranzano just as Stefano Magaddino had, but it was the opinion of the group as a whole that something had to change. Luciano would end up spearheading the group and explained that while they were fighting one another over rackets, the Jews and the Irish were getting wealthy while all we're doing is killing each other. And it just didn't make sense to him. All of these things aggravated Masseria to no end. Masseria didn't like the fact that Luciano liked Costello. He didn't like the fact that he was hanging out with other people. And so he sort of begins to mistrust Luciano. Luciano knew something had to be done. So in 1931, Luciano begins to suspect that Masseria probably likely was going to try to have him killed if he got the opportunity. He also realized that there was no way that Masseria could win the war. And he also knew enough to know that his power at such a young age was probably something that was going to sort of start tickling Masseria's asshole the wrong way. So Luciano ends up sending word to Salvatore Maranzano, who in 1929 actually had Luciano almost killed. He had him kidnapped, tied to put him tied up by his hands to a beam in Staten Island, and they beat him with fucking lead pipes, and they cut him with a knife. The beating left him with scars and a droopy eye. They almost killed him. And the only reason why they did it was because they wanted to know where Jack Legg's diamond was. And Luciano refused to give him up, refused to say anything about him. And Luciano would pass word to Maranzano that he had a deal, that he would totally take out and kill Masseria in turn for getting all of his gambling, all of his rackets, all of his entirety of his rackets, and he would want to be named as Maranzano's underboss. Maranzano would agree to that, but probably really had no interest in giving Luciano anything in the end. But Luciano was a lot smarter than Maranzano was at the time, I think. And what ends up happening is Masseria gets tipped off. Who do you think tipped him off? Joe Bonanno. You believe that shit? Joe Bonanno went and told Joe Masseria he was playing both sides of the fucking coin, that prick. And Joe Adonis ends up getting summoned by Masseria, and he's basically told, look, Joe Bonanno came to me, told me that this is going on. I want you to kill Lucky Luciano. And Adonis isn't a stupid guy. And he realizes that the tide is turning, and he ends up going to Lucky Luciano, and he tips him off about the murder contract. Luciano had previously wanted to lie sort of in wait, so to speak, for Masseria. But now that the contract was out on his head, he knew that Joe Adonis would only be able to hold out for so long. In other words, by saying, he's only going to be able to tell Masseria so many times, I couldn't find him before either Adonis gets killed or they actually find Luciano. So Luciano moves immediately. He sent word that he wanted to sit down with Masseria just to cool temperatures, just sort of playing it like, let's play cards and talk about business, totally playing Masseria. Masseria should have been skeptical, should have been weary, but he wasn't, and he would end up paying for his life. Luciano would go to Brooklyn to a place by the name of Villa Tomorrow, which was on Coney Island, April 13th of 1931. The guys, all kind of sat down and began playing cards. In a scene exactly like The Godfather, Lucky Luciano gets up because he's got to take a squirt. So he gets up, he goes to head to the restroom. The doors fly open. Albert Anastasia. Just imagine, just shut your eyes for a minute and imagine this. You're playing cards. Your pal gets up to go take a piss. The doors fly open. Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Frank Costello, and Joe Adonis come into the doors. Guns blasted immediately. Joe Masseria gets whacked exactly where he's sitting. This would effectively end not just the Castellammarese War, but it also made Salvatore Maranzano the effective winner of the war and the boss of bosses. In return for Luciano killing Masseria, Maranzano hands Lucky Luciano Masseria's rackets, and he names him his underboss. And that is part one of the Genovese crime family. And we know where it's going from here. But I think what's important about this first part, if I had to surmise, was how the Genovese crime family got their start. And I think at times when we've covered, and I'm probably guilty of this, when we have covered Joe Masseria and Maranzano, sometimes we get the impression, and I've used the phrase mustache Pete's. They were guys that were greedy. They were guys that just saw things their own way. But I think when you look now at the way, at least that I sort of organized this in a way that can be understood a little bit better, is that not only were they bigoted, not only were they selfish, but think about, they were fighting over an entire city. And there was really, at the end of the day, only two left, Maranzano and Masseria. They could have easily split the city in half, but both were so greedy that they couldn't let go. And so you have all of these young guys, specifically Luciano, who brings in Costello, Rothstein, Anastasia, and Genovese. These guys are killers, and you bring them in to protect your rackets. At some point, it had to dawn on this guy, especially Masseria. And we all know how this story ends. We know Maranzano's going to get his. That's just coming. You know it's coming. But these guys fought over money. And so when Luciano comes in and starts talking with everybody, he says, these guys are like 20 years older than us. They've been here a while. They're fighting over the same bullshit. Like, the Irish and the Jews are getting rich, and we're killing each other and going to jail, and for what? And so there needed to be a change. And this is one of those instances where, first of all, if Luciano's killed in Staten Island by Maranzano, I believe, 1931? No, that would have been 1929. Then a lot of what we know about American Cosa Nostra doesn't become what it becomes. And we've talked about it before. Lucky Luciano was not the inventor of the Commission of the Five Families. That had always been sort of an idea that different guys had. Luciano was the one guy that was able to bring it to the table and then enforce it and make it what it is. And then make the five families, and then sort of, make the National Crime Syndicate. And it would go through a couple of different variations, because before Cuba, Havana Conference and the Atlantic City Conference, they were doing things a little bit. They sort of was a National Crime Syndicate. And the whole idea with that was, well, all of organized crime is under one umbrella. And that was nothing new. But then once they take New York and they do the five families, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about too with this crime family. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we know that it went from the Morello to the Luciano to the Genovese crime family. But if you were going to call the Genovese crime family something different, it would have been the Morello crime family, the Morello-Lupo crime family. In my opinion, and no disrespect to Vito Genovese, it should be the Luciano crime family after everything Lucky Luciano did. But that's something we're going to get into as we continue next week for part 2 of the Genovese crime family. And we will be starting from 1931 and probably go through 1950. And I'm sure that we're going to talk, we will end up talking a lot about Cuba again. We're going to talk a lot about World War II. We're going to talk about a lot of things, but it's important because I believe that everything that we've talked about, I mean, even if you look at it on its basis, and then I'll stop and we'll get out of here for this week, is Maranzano, a lot of people have said, was just a fucking pig and a fucking idiot, was just greedy, but the guy almost had the fucking patience of a fucking bull, because he lets Masseria do like 10 things before he fucking reacts. And I don't think that's been something that, if you go and you look on any podcast, or you look on any show on YouTube, whatever the case may be, you're not going to see anybody talk about that kind of stuff. He had to have patience, because if he was so greedy and so impotent and so hell-bent on murder and mayhem, the minute that fucking Milazzo gets killed in Detroit, all hell should have broken loose. And why Zarelli and Taco didn't react is probably likely because Maranzano told them relax, he'd take care of it. Because by all rights, Zarelli and Taco had every reason in the world to go fucking apeshit and kill Amare and just start a whole war up in Detroit, because that's what it could have done. But you had here you have Masseria, who's so pissed off that Milazzo didn't use his power to sort of bend the Union Siciliani for him to beat Capone in a beef. He's resenting the prick and wants to see him killed. And then just to throw more shit in Detroit's face, he kills fucking Joe Aiello, who was the Detroit leader of the Union Sicilian. So there you go. Treachery around every corner. All right, so that's going to be it for this week. Next week, we will be back with, obviously, probably a little Q&A. Probably we'll have some more mob news. Obviously, more stuff to talk about Philadelphia and in New York. We will have part 2 of the Genovese crime family, along with some other snippets. So I hope you enjoyed part 1 of the Genovese crime family. Let me know. Send us an email at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com. Also, remember, tomorrow's 1 o'clock. Cut date for the contest. Remember, in the subject, answers for contest. Also, let me know if you're East Coast, West Coast, or Midwest. That way we know. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'm going to go enjoy the next few days of vacation that I have and try to stay out of fucking trouble, if you know what I mean. In the meantime, any questions, complaints, threats, or what have you, you know where to address them, as always. Thanks for listening, and we will see everybody next week.